Um, so look, I'm going to go through the greenhouse gas emissions projections and what we're seeing in the numbers for 2021 to 2030 primarily, and also then for the national targets. And then finally, I'll take a look at where we're at and where we're projecting we'll be with the EU targets. And then we'll pass on to Suzanne, who will go into a bit more detail, particularly around the sectoral breakdown of emissions. First of all, just to highlight where we're at in the EPA. So this emission statistics team is one piece of the climate work of the EPA, where we also have activity related to the climate research, emissions trading, and national dialogue and climate action, among others. And also, while the EPA has the lead statutory responsibility for inventory compilation and projections, we work in cooperation with other agencies and to provide essential data and modelling. So in particular, we have our key partners on the screen here, the SCI, NESRI and Chagas for modelling, and then others for providing data that allow us to produce these projections. The role of the EPA in this area is to produce greenhouse gas and air pollutant images and projections to fulfil our international commitments, but also to provide the evidence base for national climate policy. And just to give you a quick intro into what we produce, we produce data for the EU and UN in that kind of January to March timeframe in terms of this report coming out in June. And then this is for the projections, and then we'll be following with a further report, which will be the initial look at the 2022 inventory before finalised data goes to the EU and the following year. So as was just highlighted at the beginning, we're projecting that we'll achieve a reduction of 29% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and that's compared to 2018 in our additional measures scenario, and that's compared to the target of 51%. We're saying that almost all the sectors are projected to breach their sectoral emission ceilings for 2025 and 2030, including key ones like agriculture, electricity, industry and transport. And we're also saying that the overall carbon budgets are all projected to be exceeded. We have a new 2030 EU effort sharing emissions reduction target just come in of 42%, and we are projecting that that would need additional emission reduction measures beyond what we're projecting to achieve also. I'll be talking a little bit about existing measures and additional measures, so maybe just a little recap on what those are. So existing measures are measures committed to by government and in place before the end of the latest inventory year. So first of all, any measures since 2021 won't be in the existing measure scenario, so that would include the Climate Action Plan for 2023, for example. There also needs to be a high degree of certainty in relation to the existing measure scenario, so legislation, financial human resources in place, official government decisions, things are happening to really give us that confidence that those measures will definitely happen. In terms of the additional measures scenario, we're looking at further measures in addition, and as well, so it includes the existing measure scenario plus more, and the more would be measures that are in government plans, such as the 2023 Climate Action Plan. And we are able to bring in, as Emer pointed out, plans, measures that have an implementation pathway that can be modelled in the projection. So there are things that we still need additional work on with the various stakeholders to be able to bring it into the modelling. In terms of compliance and the national targets, this is just to show us what it looks like in comparison. So the orange line at the top are the existing measures projections, and the blue line the additional measures projections, which include the bulk of the actions in the 2023 Climate Action Plan. To be clear, both of these include LULUCF because the national target for and that's, sorry, just to be not put acronyms on the screen, that's land use change and forestry, and that is included in the national 51% reduction target. So all of these are on a comparable basis, and you can see that there is a significant gap remaining. The existing measure projection reduction is about 11% on the 2018 level by 2030. The additional measures was 29%, and the grey line is the target, which is a 51% reduction. So a substantial extra distance to travel. In terms of the carbon budgets, I mean, the carbon budgets were obviously defined to implement a 51% reduction target, and we've a budget of 295 million tonnes for the first period from 2021 to 25, and 200 million tonnes for the second period. And what we're saying for those two periods combined is that we're seeing an exceedance in both scenarios of approximately 24% in the additional measure scenario and 34% in the existing measure scenario. So both exceeded. The third budget period from 2031 to 35 is also projected to be exceeded by a wide margin, but we're not particularly focusing on that yet because we don't have there aren't that many measures in place to achieve that budget yet, and it's a preliminary budget. The sectoral ceilings which have come in since the last projections report we produced, and sectoral targets have been are in this report, I should say, for the first time. So we tried to present them in a way that makes sense. What we're seeing here, if we just look initially at the sectoral targets themselves. So, for example, the right-hand column there for electricity in 2030, there's a target of a 75% reduction, and what we're seeing here in our projections is that the additional measure scenario gets to 62%. So we're seeing fairly substantial shortfalls in reaching those targets across most sectors, with the exception of the residential and commercial buildings sectors in this presentation. There is no ceiling, or target yet for the land use change and forestry sector. Just to put it a bit more visually, if we look at the sectoral ceilings, so there are ceilings associated for the two budget periods with those targets that we just spoke about, and we can see where the exceedances are. The buildings residential in terms of the second budget period is the only sector where we're complying with the ceiling, and we can see the gap from the ceiling there with the black line for electricity, transport, and industry is particularly large proportionally in the second budget period. But we can see from this how the ceilings are not the amount of emissions in the ceiling for different sectors is substantially different, because obviously all sectors are not the same. So that's the national situation for sectoral ceilings and carbon budgets. What we do want to point out, because there is more to it than simply the additional measure scenario. There are some measures in the Climate Action Plan 2023 for which a pathway could not yet be modelled, and for different varying reasons. The first key one is there is an unallocated saving of 5.25 million tonnes per year in the 26 to 30 period in the Climate Action Plan 2023, and that's not something we can model until we've got more detail about where, in what sectors it will apply, because we do the modelling based on the measure itself, not on a saving as such. In terms of the electricity sector, we do have the 80% renewable energy target from the Climate Action Plan is modelled, but just to be clear, that the gigawatt targets for onshore wind and solar were not required to be met to achieve that in these projections. So we have 7.8 gigawatts of onshore wind and 6 gigawatts of solar, compared to 9 and 8 as it was envisaged in the plan. And we do also have the 5 gigawatts of offshore wind as well. The full target of 2 gigawatts for flexible gas generation wasn't possible to model yet, but we have 1.2 gigawatts in there. Measures aimed at achieving emissions savings from embodied carbon, we don't have those modelled yet. The implication of those would be ultimately a reduction in emissions associated with cement production at some point. And then the full targets for the carbon neutral heating in industry are not quite there, although we do have 60% modelled. Agriculture diversification measures of around 1.5 million tonnes by 2030 are not currently modelled, but we do have modelled the remaining nitrogen and nitrous oxide and methane reduction measures in the projections. And just to say, in total, from what detail we can glean from the Climate Action Plan, if we added together all of those savings that we are not able to model, we'd be looking at anywhere around 9 million tonnes of additional savings compared to what we have modelled. And if we added that back to if we took those savings off, I should say, our 2030 emissions projection, we'd be looking at somewhere around a 42% reduction in emissions compared to the 29% that we have in our additional measure scenario. So still short of the 51% target in our projections. Just having a look at the EU targets then as well briefly. There is the original 2030 target of a 30% reduction, which was spelled out with a variety of annual emission allocations and a couple of flexibilities that were allowed to be used. We are projecting in the additional measure scenario that could be achieved using the two flexibilities. And then that's what we have displayed in the report. There is now a new 42% reduction target that is in place, but the full detail of the binding annual limits and how the LULUCF is brought into that as well is not fully there yet. So we are waiting until that's all that information is there before we go into detailed analysis versus the EU targets. But the headline 42% reduction target would not be met with these projections. The assessment, so the assessment, as I say, is made against the existing annual emission allocations, and I'll just put that on a graph for the moment. You can see that the orange line there, this is a subsector of the overall emissions, if you like. So these are the emissions covered by the effort sharing regulation, not including the emissions trading sector. And in that subsector, the additional measures projection, the orange line there, cumulatively complies with what would be the dotted green line, which is the annual emission allocations, plus the two flexibilities that are available to us. So there's an ETS flexibility and a LULUCF flexibility available to be used. And yeah, if we with the currently projected levels of removals that might be available under the LULUCF flexibility, we would comply by about 2 million tonnes of an overall surplus. So that's the existing situation. But as I say, by the time we come back to this next year, we'll have a whole different set of targets in relation to the Fit for 55 measures and the 42% target. So this is a in flux at the moment. So thank you very much for that. That's the brief introduction to the compliance section.